Mrs. Margaret Thatcher is here on Panorama tonight. Sometime before October 1979 there has to be a general election, and she would appear to stand a good chance of becoming the next Prime Minister. And with all the uncertainty at Westminster, that election could still be as early as this autumn. Good evening. With me to question Mrs. Thatcher for the next 50 minutes are Mary Goldring, economic journalist, Peter Jenkins of The Guardian, and Anthony Shrimsley, assistant editor of The Sun. Mrs. Thatcher, I'd like to devote most of the time of this discussion to your view of how Britain would change under your leadership. But since it is on everybody's mind today, perhaps I could just start with the affair at Grunwick and ask you, if you had been Prime Minister, whether you would have handled the Grunwick dispute differently from the way it has been handled, and in particular, whether you would have been able to do anything or sought to do anything to limit the numbers of pickets turning up there.
First, I think that violence and intimidation of the kind we've seen are never justified in pursuit of any aim. And what we've seen on the television screens has, I think, horrified many, many people, including many, many trade unionists who've been just as perturbed by it as I have. I think, therefore, it would have been justified to ask that you do not have mass picketing at all. That cannot be peaceful picketing.
Would you have made it a precondition of government action, or tried to get the TUC to make it a precondition of involvement in trying to settle the dispute, that the mass picketing was stopped? I mean, what pressure would you have sought to use?
No, I don't think you could make it a precondition. Once, in fact, you've got what you have now, both a court case and a court of inquiry going, I think you are entitled to ask that mass picketing should cease.
Would you seek legislation in any way to protect workers from picketing of the scale that there's been today, of 10,000 people turning up at the factory gates?
I do think some of the laws of picketing need, if I say need changing, I think that we need a voluntary code of practice. I've spent some time trying to go through the law on picketing. In fact, it's clear, except on one particular, and that is numbers. It is clear that it's only peaceful persuasion that's permitted. It's clear that there's no right to stop a vehicle at all. It is clear that at some stage numbers can become obstruction, and they can become intimidation and violence and mob rule. At what point isn't clear. Now, if you then try to alter the law, I'm not certain that you'd have managed to have stopped what happened today. I think it's far better to try to do it by something that we were getting towards in 1974, a code of practice about who should be entitled to picket and how many. But you can only do that in conjunction with the unions themselves.
Well, Mrs. Thatcher, I'd like to take you on to something about the Grunwick dispute, which I think is worrying a lot of people about the Conservative Party. They say, OK, we've seen violence in the picket lines, policemen being injured again even today, mobs in the streets. But if the Conservative Party were elected facing trade union power, wouldn't there be Grunwicks every day? Wouldn't you be facing trade union power being demonstrated on a political front, on an economic front? Wouldn't the kind of mass operation which we are seeing be mounted as a political action against you? And how would you deal with that?
Well, if it is, parliamentary democracy is at an end. If we're going to see what we've seen today with this government on a larger scale, then you will see it with any government which is in power under the parliamentary system. And someday, if we're to have parliamentary democracy, we shall have to stand up and fight it. But I don't believe that your premise is correct. As you know, about 1/3 of the people who belong to trade unions regularly vote Conservative. Sometimes more, sometimes a little bit less. At the moment, I believe it's a lot more. I don't think they like what is happening, and I think that they will be quite active to try to stop it. The postbag that I have coming in is coming in just as much from members of trade unions against intimidation, against violence, saying this has nothing to do with trade unionism. This is not trade unionism. What we have to get rid of are the wreckers in society. And we all of us, all of us have to combine to get rid of those wreckers and see that they don't have their way, trade unionists as well as others.
If I could just come back on that a bit. One or two people would say, however, that as well as standing up for a particular point, one or two of your backbenchers or associates, people in the National Association of Freedom, Mr. John Gorst and so on, seem to be rather actively stirring it up, it would be said.
By whom? By whom?
It is said by Labour Party critics, it's said by trade unionists that...
and stirring it up in what way?
In the way of resisting, for example, Apex trying to get recognition, in the way of threatening to take on the postal workers.
That is before the court at the present time. That is a matter which is now being decided before the court, and according to today's news, judgment will be given tomorrow. These are matters for the courts to decide when they are in dispute, and I do think it's important that members of Parliament in Parliament should not try to resolve disputes any more than we can try to sort out legal cases in Parliament. The courts of law are the place, and as a court of inquiry.
What is before the High Court, and indeed the Lord Chief Justice, who I very much doubt whether he will be influenced by anything that we say here tonight, but what is before the High Court is the question of whether Acas properly conducted the ballot at Grunwick. A court of inquiry is also taking place today where the merits of the dispute are being discussed, and they've been discussed. For example, Mrs. Desai was giving evidence to the Court of Inquiry this morning and complaining about working conditions at the plant. So I think that you're perfectly free, if you feel politically able, to say what you wish about it. And what I would like to ask you is that whether, having deplored the violence and the intimidation, and everybody will agree about that, you're surely not characterising this firm as being a model employer, or Mr. Ward as being the epitome of the conservative small business.
I make no judgment about the dispute at Grunwick. It's not for me to do so.
Mrs. Thatcher, can we move on, I think, from Grunwick now, because we have...
Can I just go back to Mr. Daly? I think you might be asking me whether there's a right to join a trade union.
Well, I will ask you that if you want to answer that question, yes.
Thank you very much. That was enshrined in our 1971 Industrial Relations Act. I believe that the freedom is part of a whole freedom, a right to join or not to join a trade union. Unfortunately, there are those who accept half of the freedom, the right to join a trade union, who will not accept the other half, the right not to join a trade union. When you get onto the details of the dispute, none of us knows all of the details. All my life, having been involved with the law, I've tried to follow one rule: first find out the facts. We cannot know all the facts because we haven't been inside and seen the conditions. So I think it's best not to make a judgment here unless you know the facts.
But the right to join a trade union, I mean, all right, let's get away from the details of the Grunwick dispute, but the right to join a trade union is more than an abstract right. And in your statements and things that you've said on this programme already tonight, you seem to be emphasising all the time the behaviour of the pickets and the violence in the streets, and giving very little emphasis to these rather poor Asian workers working at this plant, seeking to improve their conditions.
Violence and intimidation is never justified. I must say that I have had the greatest admiration for those people who, in the bus, have gone through the picket lines day after day. Their courage and the courage of the bus driver today, when that bus was turned back, I think is very great indeed, and I can only say that I'm full of admiration for it. They seem determined enough still to go in today and go through the picket lines. The only thing that I could do, I did a few days ago. I wanted to know what it felt like as a person to have to run the gauntlet of that sort of behaviour. And so I did ask my PPS to go in on the bus through the picket lines. And I think you just have to hand it to those workers for their courage.
We were talking about the attitude of the Conservative Party and of yourself to trade unions. I was very struck by a speech you made to Conservative trade unionists in which you called the trade unions a minority interest. Now, I know numerically speaking that is correct, but it struck me as being an unrealistic way of thinking about trade unionism and of trying to get people to think about trade unionism, to say that it was a minority interest. What did you actually mean by saying that?
What you said, arithmetically, it's correct. The trade unions are a very powerful interest. Of course they are. There are other very powerful interests, some of them numerically not as great. Compared with Parliament, it is a minority interest. It's a powerful group, but it's not one so powerful that its power is greater or should ever be greater than Parliament. Parliament's the only body that governs all of the people and is elected to govern all of the people.
Are they treated as more important than they should be?
I think there has been a feeling, which I think was noted by many people in one of those opinion surveys, I think it was towards the beginning of the year, when people said they thought Jack Jones was more powerful than the Prime Minister. That was a pretty appalling result. because in fact your Prime Minister is head of the government and responsible to Parliament. So that showed the way that people were thinking.
You agree
But you know, that just isn't right. The trade unions are a powerful group, but they're not and must never be the government of the country. No, I don't. I know full well all the difficulties between the Labour Party and the trade unions. You often talk about difficulties of the Conservative Party and trade unions, but there are many difficulties between the Labour Party and trade unions for the simple reason that the trade unions, as a matter of fact, control the Labour Party. Of the numbers on the executive of the Labour Party, it's either 25 or 26. The trade unions can decide who fills 18 of the places. Of the number of votes at the Labour Party conference, which I think, because they do it on a block vote basis, is about 6.5 million, the Labour Party control 5.5 million. So they control the Labour Party conference, they control the Labour Party executive, so they control the Labour Party. Now, I think trade unions have an extremely important job to do. They also happen to represent a lot of Conservatives, and I think that they must take that into account in the way they tackle their affairs. Their job is to look after their members at their place of work and their interest. It's not to get involved in party politics at a national level.
But isn't that exactly how the Labour Party grew up, and isn't that exactly the way that many trade unionists think their influence should be wielded, as a political force?
I think that there are some at the top who thought that it should be wielded that way, but if ever I tackle any of the union leaders at the top and say, are you prepared to work with any elected government, they will always say yes. And of course they have to say yes, and it's quite right that they should not only say yes but believe it, because if they don't, I carry on with what we said at the beginning, democracy would be at an end.
In practical terms, what have you got to offer them? You see, the Labour government has brought a lot of union cooperation since the 74 election by a whole series of laws that the unions asked for and they got. Now, what have you got to offer?
In practical terms, members of trade unions are voting for us in by-elections far more than they are for the Labour Party, because in practical terms they reckon that the deal done in their name, called the social contract, didn't get them better living standards, it got them worse. The facts are that under Labour the standard of living has actually declined. Under the social contract it's declined heavily. The people are angry because Labour's let them down, and it has let them down. The amount they pay in tax is heavier than they ever thought, and they're revolting against it.
For manual workers this is relatively new, though until the last 6 months they had been doing very well indeed under Labour. Their earnings were keeping well ahead of prices.
Well, the average for the, let's take the average. For the average person, the average industrial worker in February 1974, when we left power, his standard of living has declined, I think it's by about £4.50 in terms of what his average wages now will buy. Oh, the arithmetical amount's gone up, but in terms of what it will buy, it's right down. So the fact is that the ordinary members of unions are saying to their own union leaders, look, you haven't done a good job for us, and they're right.
So are you going to go for union support wholly on the grounds that you can run the economy better, that you're talking about prosperity and about money?
I go for the support of everyone in Britain on the grounds that the Labour Party hasn't had any expansion at all for the last 3 years. And if we're just going to try to shuffle around the shekels between one group of workers and another, we shall none of us get any richer. And we must, in fact, go for some expansion in the economy.
Is one of your problems, Mrs. Thatcher, in coming to terms with the trade union movement, not the Labour voter who might vote Conservative, not the trade unions who might agree to work with you, but in fact industry and the city, who one often gets the impression rather like dealing with block power that they can recognise, rather like the idea of a corporate state in which they are part of the corporation, as it were, and are a bit disturbed when it looks as if all this is going to be upset and a Conservative government is going to come in which is going to try and roll back the progress of it. Is that a problem for you?
No, it isn't a problem. I think there was a time when people thought you could run things by a corporate state, by getting everything sorted out at the top and expecting everyone else to conform. That has fallen apart. And that's the lesson of what's been happening in the last 6 months. You can't get it sorted out that way because no universal decision at the top can take into account all the many varied conditions you find in industry, all the many varied skills you find in industry. No, there's going to be no difficulty. either with industry or the city. They want next time a government that will allow free enterprise to develop, that will allow initiative, that will allow incentives. They know that if we get another Labour government, you'll have masses and masses more nationalisation and the left-wingers will dominate.
But they do tend to get rather nervous on the stock exchange when election talk comes into the air. How would you explain that?
The stock exchange never likes uncertainty. And I think, if you want my interpretation, I think they wanted this government to carry the can for some of the things they've done and be seen to carry it before an election. I have no doubt that as we come up to an election, they will support a party that goes for a freer enterprise, less taxation, incentives, and support it 100%. And so, I believe, will the vast majority of the people in Britain.
Can we come then to the differences that you would like to see? And the right approach has spelt it out, you refer to it very often. You said a moment ago that the Labour Party was controlled by the trade unions, but you also often talk about socialism, and you're inclined, when talking about it, to talk about fellow socialists in Russia and East Germany, about socialism leading to workers being ordered to certain jobs, about socialism and parliamentary democracy not being able to exist side by side, about socialists practicing hatred towards fellow British citizens, about it being a blind alley of history, all those expressions.
You've read my speeches rather well. Congratulations. I think that's marvellous.
I take your speeches as seriously as you take them,
Do
Mrs.
read
Thatcher.
some of Winston's, you'll find some of these similar sentiments.
When you say all those things, are you talking about Jim Callaghan's Lib-Lab coalition that we have at the moment, or are you talking about some other party that you think is trying to take over the Labour Party?
Jim Callaghan's Lib-Lab coalition is a Lib coalition, a Social Democrat coalition, and an extreme left of the Labour Party coalition. When I first went into Parliament 18 years ago, there were only 7 or 8 extreme left-wingers. We all knew who they were. We just thought that it was rather a characteristic of the British system that we had 1 or 2 extreme left-wingers. Now I believe there are about 80 members of the Tribune group. You know what happens, they've got Trotskyites even in the Labour Party. Jim Callaghan wanted to turn out the Trotskyite. He couldn't. He wasn't allowed to. You know full well that they've got a report in the Labour Party about what they call Entryism, which is infiltration into the local constituency parties by the extreme left-wing elements. It's not going to be published. Why? Because it would do too much damage. Yes, I am. I am saying that if you go along the socialist road, there's only one way for it to end up. If you go on taking everything into ownership, everything into state ownership, all the decisions made by the state, taking a larger and larger proportion of income in taxation, there is only one end of the road, and I'm trying to stop people from going there.
So that the Jim Callaghan, who in a speech in Aberystwyth said that he commended to his party the old ideals of compassion and service rather than dogma, he in fact, by default you're saying, is hell-bent on Marxism and the end of parliamentary democracy.
It's the same Jim Callaghan that has to rely on the votes of 80 of the Tribune group in the House of Commons, is the same Jim Callaghan that cannot turn out Trotskyists from his own Labour Party headquarters, is the same Jim Callaghan but tries but cannot succeed. And once you start to compromise with the left, first you compromise with the near left, then they're fanatical. I always give them this, they're fanatical. Then you compromise with the middle left. Then you find yourselves compromising with the far left. Never forget that some of the tyrannical regimes have come into power by constitutional means. I've travelled in many communist countries. Is there a correct view? And mercifully here there is not a correct view. But we've moved in that direction, and one thing which frightens me, there is now a correct union to join in some industries, and if you do not join it, you lose your job under Michael Foot's legislation without compensation, without appeal. That frightens me. A step in that direction frightens me, and we have to fight it now. If you don't fight when the knock comes at your neighbour's door, what right have you to expect them to fight when it comes at your door?
Well, insofar as we have gone too far down the road to East European-style socialism, some viewers may think that it's a bit of exaggeration to put it that way, but the question becomes how far, under a Conservative government led by you, will we come back down that road? Now, I think it was Evelyn Waugh who once lamented that the Conservative Party had never succeeded in putting the clock back by 1 minute. Do you expect to be an exception to his rule.
Well, as a matter of fact, he wasn't quite right. I don't know whether you remember, but I do. The government just after 6 years of socialism, 1951, Winston was the Prime Minister, Butler was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and for the rest of the 13 years we were putting the clock, I would say, forward, not back. We were putting it forward in that we were getting again to a freer society from the highly controlled society we got to. You remember we had to dismantle all those myriad regulations we had in wartime, including rationing, including masses of restrictions. We had to reduce the level of taxation. We did. In fact, that was the only period when we had expansion and prosperity. As a matter of fact, we denationalized steel as well. So the clock was not only put back, but a great deal of power and a great deal of resources were returned to the people of Britain, and the state left with fewer powers. So he's not technically correct, but it's the kind of thing that I would hope to do next time. And that's why I cited as an example.
I know you expressed your admiration before for Mr. Butler's 1952 budget. 53 budget. Now, I was looking through some files the other day to an interview that I did with Ian MacLeod just before he died, and I asked him what book had most influenced him, and he cited Mr. Butler's 1953 budget as the text which he thought had the greatest influence.
It was an incentive budget.
Yeah. But now then, poor Mr. MacLeod dies, and we get Mr. Barber as Chancellor and under a Conservative government, and in that first budget, you'll no doubt remember very clearly, what happened, sixpence off the income tax, but it was hardly the start of a counter-revolution.
Well, sixpence off the income tax, and in fact...
6p.
Yes, but a good deal more than that. Do remember that the surtax levels were changed, and if they weren't, your surtax would still be starting at about the level of £2,000 a year, which is £40 a week. So do give him credit for what he did. He also did a number of things which people said weren't technically possible. He merged surtax and income tax, but he did start on the incentive road. I hope we'll have longer to pursue it, but it's the road I intend to start on, and in no uncertain way.
It's the order of that enterprise that I'm trying to get to. You see how big an impact you have to make when you come in and start if you're really trying to turn things around the other way.
I think you have to make quite an impact when you start. Obviously, we've had to think about this a good deal, with the levels of taxation now so high that we never thought they would get up to this level. The most urgent thing to do, I have no doubt, is to reduce the direct level of taxation, and it is at all levels of income, because the people who complain to me are just as much the retired as those who are at work. It is the most urgent thing to do. I think one of the dangers is that people then say, oh, but that will lose you so much income, you can't do it, you'll get public expenditure problems. I think that's far too restricted a view to take. You know, when you sometimes reduce tax, you don't necessarily reduce the yield, because the incentive itself means that people work harder, get more income, and therefore you get the same tax yield from a greater amount of income, although the rates are lower. That's the most important thing. We've gone as far as we can by redistribution. We're just not getting the creation of wealth, and incentives are the key. And we'll start well, and we'll carry on well. And please, I'd like 13 years to do it.
Just coming back, Mrs. Thatcher, to your Ian MacLeod lecture, which clearly was intended to be a significant statement of your attitude. 2 points. A lot of people would find it interesting that it should be the Ian MacLeod occasion, in that he had the reputation of being very much a middle way, moderate conservative. You described him, in fact, as a pragmatist, I think, in this. Which means
in the true sense of the term.
Yes, by all
which
means.
is putting your principles into practice.
Okay. But you also have the reputation of being something of a right-winger. Indeed, it might be said that you were elected leader of the Conservative Party because the right wing of the party felt it was time that they had a go. Now, are you a pragmatist or are you a right-winger?
Will you tell me what you mean by a right-winger, and I'll try to answer you.
Well, someone who, according to the definition of people who think they were supporters of Ian MacLeod, would say that you would pay less heed to compassion, less heed to looking after the hard-up people in society than you would to market forces, the crude economic judgments, and so on.
The fact is, you can't look after the hard-up people in society unless you're creating enough wealth to do so. I was Ian MacLeod's number 2, and I worked with him. And I know his views very well, and they don't differ very much from mine. He knew, as I knew, that someone has to make the money before you really have enough to help the worse off members of society. Good intentions aren't enough. You do need hard cash. But you say, am I right-wing? And I ask you what it is. Because these days, if you want lower tax, it's called right-wing. If you support the police, it's called right-wing. If you say you must uphold the rule of law, it's called right-wing. If you say that you want to sell council houses and you want increased owner occupation, it's called right-wing. I want all of those things. If you say that you want to uphold standards in education and that children should be effectively taught and not just wait until they learn, then it's called right-wing. In those senses, yes. If you call that right-wing, I am right-wing, but I'm not as right-wing as 75% of the people of Britain.
I'd like to take you up on your taxation points later on, but as we're turning the clock back, in this particular MacLeod speech we're talking about, you made a great pitch at religion. And some people would say that you were setting out another claim that the Church of England's the Tory party at prayer and they're not going to like it very much. What point were you trying to get over?
The fundamental thing that the whole philosophy of the Conservative Party is based upon the freedom of the individual. Now, where does the freedom of the individual come from? It really comes from, well, three sources. First, you could say it came from Greek philosophy. Secondly, it comes from the Old Testament, the Jewish creed, and thirdly, from the New Testament. But that is one of the few basic religious creeds which start with the individual. And your whole idea and ideal of the sanctity of the individual is basically a religious idea.
But are you
That's
saying
what
there
I was
ain't no
trying to
Christian
get.
socialists?
No, I don't. I never, if I say our ideas have a religious base, I never exclude other people. They can say what their ideas stem from. I was saying where mine stem from, and that I believe this is the true basis of the belief in the sanctity and in the dignity and in the respect for the individual. It is a very, very deeply felt philosophy and belief. I could also point to speeches of Winston where he said, 1946, I remember it, at least I remember it because I've just recently looked it up, that the first duty of the Conservative Party was to uphold religion. He said the Christian religion. I think that it's both the Christian religion and the Old Testament creed as well, and of course some of it comes from Greek philosophy. I don't claim exclusively that my creed comes from that, but I do claim that that is the true basis of belief in the individual.
Isn't one of the characteristics of the British political system that it extends a wide tolerance to its opponents? I just wonder whether what you've said so far, and what you've said about Jim Callaghan being party to, unwittingly, the end of parliamentary democracy and all the rest of it.
No, I have not said that. I have not said that. What I have said is that he relies on the support of 80 Tribune Group members. You've seen, for example, what the ex-chairman of the Tribune Group wrote recently, that he finds the difference between his views and those of the Communist Party negligible, that he wants again the Communist Party to be affiliated to the Labour Party. I have also to make my assessment of my opponents. There is no point in ignoring facts. I wouldn't be a responsible leader if I were to ignore the facts. You might just be interested in another thing. Whenever I go around on walkabouts in the North Country and in the Midlands, I go about on walkabouts in the South too, but I'm particularly tackled by people there who say that they recognise that this is one of the problems.
Won't a radical break of the kind you're talking about, and what I see as perhaps a lack of tolerance for the other side, the hustings and the ballot box in the end put people off because they believe in one government building on the achievements of another, and you seem to deny the other side in politics any achievements at all. You say simply that it's going to lead to a disastrous solution for this country in the end if people go on electing Labour governments.
You don't tolerate absence of freedom. By the time freedom is absent, you've no choice about anything. Your only choice is to fight for it while you've still got some. Your only choice is to point out that if at each time you go on further along the socialist road, nearer and nearer to the communist state, then the consequences of the communist state will follow.
Can I ask you on another subject, although one which also perhaps has some practical implications for freedom? Do you think that this country has absorbed just about as many immigrants as it can absorb?
I think there is a great worry about the numbers of immigrants who are still coming in. I think, to use one of your words, we are a very tolerant people in this country, and I will not have any difference whatsoever on grounds of colour or religion. But I think people are worried that we still have large numbers coming in. Sometimes it was 30,000, now I believe it's nearer between 50 and 60,000. And the Franks report, I think, puts it at about 1.75 million from the new Commonwealth here now, and that it's likely to be between 3 and 4 million by the end of the century. If you want to keep racial harmony here, I believe you've got to recognise people's fears on the numbers issue and take steps severely to reduce the numbers coming in.
Now, what steps? Quotas?
We haven't yet debated the report from the Select Committee in the House of Commons yet, and we haven't yet debated the Franks report. As you know, that came out against a register of dependents, but it didn't say that a register of dependents was impossible. We still don't know quite how many dependents there are overseas to come in. Until we know that, it's going to be difficult to find the precise solution. We have some idea of the numbers of tax allowances that have been claimed in respect of dependents overseas, and that, as you know, is going to be dealt with next year. But until we've debated it, I think it's difficult to be precise in specifying methods.
And you said
but I am certain that you've got to deal with the numbers issue if you want to keep your race relations good, which I do.
You also stated your how you obviously upheld the right to equal treatment of everybody and so on. But I mean, what role do you recognise the law to play in this? The Race Discrimination Act. I mean, is that a good law, or would you rather take this out of the law?
There were parts. We did not vote against the second reading of the Act. There were parts which we voted against. There is one part where they do away with intent altogether. And it does seem to me that you must have an intent racially to discriminate to be found guilty of that.
But in general,
it's not, I believe, so under present law.
In general, is this something the law can do? Can the law make women more equal? Can the law make races more equal?
You can do a certain amount by the law, but as I know, you can't do it all. In the end, it has to be by public opinion, the general climate of opinion, as much as the law. And therefore I do think it helps when all of us make statements saying we're all equal before the law, and we must be tolerant, but we must deal with numbers.
Mrs. Thatcher, before we turn, which we should in just a moment, to wages and investment and the expansion of the British economy as you see it, can I just ask a question about schools? You say that you're keen to see a degree of parental choice in education in the state system. It seems likely that if choice is given to parents, they will all want to send their children to the best school in their area, and there'll be a queue. How would you see the decision being taken as to which children should be let in to particular schools?
First, I tried to have a choice even between comprehensive schools, because there are some areas which are totally comprehensive, but of course the character of a school varies very much according to the head teacher and the staff, according to the curriculum and according to the teaching methods. And you'll find that parents have very decided views about the curriculum and about teaching methods. And that really is almost as important as the kind of school to which you go. Some of them will have very decided views about whether you should have streaming in schools or not. So there's a lot more to it than just the reorganisation of schools. I do think that local authorities should try not to have rigid zoning. You will find that if all of your parents are trying to get their children into a particular school, it's because the education at that school is good. And you really then it should have an effect upon both the curriculum and teaching methods in other schools. There are, of course, differences. Try as you may, you can never overcome the home differences. So, and I don't mean the income group differences. Some parents will be interested in their children. They will do things with them. They will discuss with them. They will take an interest in the work they do. others don't. You can't overcome that by any education system.
But isn't your experience at the Ministry of Education, and the experience of all teachers who talk about it, that if you do give this degree of choice, you didn't use the words, but you get good and bad schools, and parents want to go to the good schools, and in the end you have to choose which children will be allowed there, and the teachers tend to go there as well, and you're back in the same polarity of systems that you had before the comprehensive school system became fairly normal.
Part of my philosophy when I was at education was always leave the good schools alone. They're doing a good job, and concentrate on pulling up the standards of the less good schools. I think where you have children coming from a difficult background, one of the worst things that you can do is to put them into a massive school where they don't seem to get personal attention. And I think what those children need is a great deal of personal attention. In part, you can do that by saying that schools in that area should have a greater percentage of teachers compared with the proportion of pupils. In part, you do it by saying that there are some smaller schools to go to. One of my great complaints about the comprehensive system was that you got so many large schools, which I didn't think were always best fitted to the needs of children in adolescence.
Can we turn to the economy, Mary?
Right. You tell me, Mrs. Thatcher, what you see happening to the economy.
I cannot really be very optimistic, I'm afraid. I've read all the euphoric statements, but euphoric statements have been going on for a very long time. I don't see any expansion. There's been virtually no expansion in the last 3 years. We're producing now the same amount in a 5-day week as we were producing in a 3-day week in 1974. Profits are right down, which means that there's not the base for investment and expansion. There are very few incentives. And so therefore, I don't see the basis of expansion under the present economic system that we need if we're to have a higher standard of living, or even if we're to keep up with our competitors.
What do you see happening to prices?
Prices should start to fall. How temporarily or how permanently, I don't know. I believe towards the end of the year they will be down below 17%, and they certainly should be. When I say down below 17%, I mean down below the 17%, which is the annual rate of increase. I do think the average housewife must be very confused about the way in which we talk. When we talk about the rate of increase coming down, she thinks that prices will fall. They'll still go on going up. And I don't see a time this year or next year when they will not go on going up.
Well, supposing we have an election in the autumn and you suddenly find yourself in Downing Street, what are you going to do about it, particularly about wages?
What am I going to do about wages? First, I shall not know whether there has indeed been an agreement under Phase 3, although for some time I've been saying I don't believe there will. What I will try to do is to confront people with reality. We can none of us escape it. Can I just explain what I mean?
Yes,
we
but
can
it
none
seems
of us
to me
escape
that it's already
it
been done.
indefinitely. No, it has not been done. One of the drawbacks about talking about an incomes policy is that people always look at what they're taking out. They never look at whether they're earning what they've taken out, and so you don't look at the effort going in. If you're going to take out a lot more in money incomes than you're getting in increased production, you will get inflation, and there is no way of avoiding that.
What happens if you confront the miners with reality?
If I confront the miners with reality, the reality is that if they take out a lot more in wages without production, the result will come out in prices. They're not then confronting a government. The people who pay the prices are their fellow workers and the housewives. And this is, please can I go? Because I think this is absolutely vital. Unions are not confronting governments. Governments don't pay for anything. The people do. If the miners are going to have vastly increased production, and I think the significant thing that happened last week wasn't so much the Transport and General Workers Union decision, it was the National Union of Mine Workers saying they weren't going to have productivity deals. If they earn their increases, jolly good luck to them, and jolly good luck to anyone who earns an increase. We all need them. If not, the difference comes out in one of two ways. It comes out in prices, and then their fellow workers who aren't going to get the same increases have to pay it in prices, or their or their wives do, or alternatively, it's going to come out in higher unemployment. This is what I mean about confronting people with reality. You can't escape from this.
Your economics may be very sound, but the government...
Oh, they're not economics. That's human common sense.
Let me ask you a question. But in the government acting as an employer, it is easier,
the government is not the employer of the miners.
The government is the indirect employer of the miners. But all right, but it is easier, would you not say, to confront, say, the nurses with economic reality than it is to confront the coal miners or the power workers or people who have industrial power in this society?
There won't be enough to pay the nurses unless it's made by those industries that are in business to market their products or their services. Now, if the miners by increased productivity earn it, or anyone else in any other industry, let me say this is what I'm in politics for. Good luck to those who are prepared to earn greater wages, who are prepared to make the effort. We need them and we shouldn't put such heavy tax on them. But if they're wanting to take out more for no extra effort, well, we have to have a year, because of the rapid rate of inflation, where we do take out a little bit more, because you can't stop inflation dead, I'm afraid. But I do, if I only get this point across, they're not confronting anyone except their own fellow workers if they take out more than they're going to put in. And it doesn't only apply to the miners, it applies to anyone else who's doing the same. And that means that those people working for companies who do jolly well and earn a lot more, deserve to be paid more.
But couldn't you be Mr. Healy saying that? Is there any difference actually between what Mr. Healy's engaged in now with the collapse of Phase 3?
I think Mr. Healy has believed in the corporate state and he hasn't got the results.
Yes. Could I just pursue the logic of what you're saying there, Mrs. Thatcher? I follow the argument that one lets people decide and follows the consequences. What reason is there to suppose that a government led by you would be able to be any more resolute in standing up, not to the miners or to the railwaymen, but to the consequences of this? One remembers Ted Heath coming in and allowing the Mersey Docks and Harbour Board to go broke and being quite determined that the government would not subsidise pay increases in the public sector. And in the end, when unemployment got high, suddenly the government reversed its tack, and I believe you were a member of that government. When one gets a situation where the rising price of coal puts up the price of electricity and everything else, maybe pits are closed, maybe Fords decide that they will take factories to Germany instead of to Britain and so on, how long can you face up to that without crumbling in the face of demand for reflation, some action to stop unemployment?
Reflation is printing money. Printing money is the way to renewed rising prices over and above the rate at which they're rising now. Any government that does that will be thoroughly irresponsible. When we had the problems before, you'll remember that the rate of taxation was way, way, way below what it is now. There was perhaps some leeway for socialism. There is none now. People are rebelling at the present rates of taxation. Even that isn't enough to keep this government. They're borrowing heavily. So there is no leeway for extra subsidies to subsidise wages. Where does it come from? It comes from the people who work jolly hard. And this again is the reality that one must try to get across. If any government's going to try to avoid reality, it's only building up problems for the next one. Someone's got to deal with it. We've been avoiding problems for 3 years. I'm not in politics to avoid them. I'm in politics to deal with them. But I'm in politics to deal with them working with human nature, not looking at it as if it's all the time being a different sort of confrontation. And I believe I will have the vast majority of the British people with me, because my policies make sense.
Unemployment goes from 1.5
I'm sorry, I didn't get the beginning of it.
So if the unemployment rate, which at present is approaching 1.5 million, goes to 2 million because of the consequences of excessive pay settlements, and the city and industry are clamouring for reflation, you're not going to be pushed over like anybody else. You will say, no, this is the consequence of folly.
Let's work it through. I'm afraid unemployment is going to rise. You're getting no expansion. You're not looking after small businesses. You're clobbering them hard. That is ridiculous. This is where your jobs come from. But if you, on 2 million unemployed, start to reflate on an inflation rate, which I believe will still be in double figures, What you are doing is paving the way for unemployment of 3 million, and it would be thoroughly irresponsible thing to do. Governments really must consider the longer term consequences of what they're doing. It's about time they stop doing things just for immediate advantage. That is bad government.
I don't quite see how you reconcile your earlier call for expansion with the refusal to reflate, but let that pass.
No, I will not let it pass.
Right.
Expansion is genuine expansion. That is to say that you get extra earnings when you've got extra production. Now, what's wrong with that?
Well, how do you
But
start
that is
it?
genuine expansion.
You see, you have been talking earlier about
You started by incentives.
You've been talking about incentives and the heavy burden of tax. But the only positive tax proposal that we've had from Sir Geoffrey Howe recently is to cut the top rate of personal tax to 60%. Well, fine, and we'd all be delighted. But you know what people are going to say? Tory party helping their friends again, helping the rich.
We shall not have to do it merely at the top. It will have to be all the way down. And that's why he and I are saying again and again, you must cut the direct taxation, and it has to be all the way up. It was us, and we didn't get any help from the Liberals, who tried to increase the personal allowances recently in the finance bill. And that would go all the way up. But you must try to do something to get genuine expansion. You'll only get it by incentives. That is, giving people who are prepared to work hard more.
Mrs. Thatcher, we've only got a minute or two left. Can I just put a political question to you?
Yes.
Aren't you concerned?
I thought they were all political.
Well,
what have we been talking about? But go on.
I was distinguishing between going on about economics, as a matter of fact. But what
That's politics.
Well, this is politics too. The Lib-Lab pact looks as though it could keep the Labour government in power until 79, possibly. And this is economics. If they can use the North Sea oil in that time to start the expansion, may they not take this election that everybody has been promising to you away from you and actually go to the polls at a time when Britain is expanding and growing again, and people will be prepared to vote
My fear
Labour?
is they're not going to use North Sea oil for expansion at all. They're going to use it rather like a person who's won the football pools. Sometimes some people who win the football pools really stop work and use the proceeds just to live on.
That's not what the Prime Minister said.
Well, no, maybe not what he said, is what I fear.
Why
if
do
you
you
look
fear
at
it?
some of the statements, is what's going to be done.
Why do you
because the
fear it?
royalties will come in, and I think that they will be used just for living on.
But he said he'll do exactly what you've been saying, use it on small businesses and on investment in industry.
I am used to euphoric statements from the Prime Minister. I've been listening to them for 3 years. I've been listening to statements under which inflation was going to be down to single figures by the end of 75, then it wasn't. Then to the end of 76, then it wasn't. Then to the end of 77, then it won't be. Now to the end of 78. My fear is that the proceeds of North Sea oil will not be used to put British industry in good condition to expand. It'll be used just to live on. And that, in fact, could be the most damaging way of all.
I don't want to get back into semantics about left and right, but I want to ask you a question, perhaps of a
But you're going to do just that.
No, sort of a slightly personal kind.
Yes.
I mean, you strike me as somebody who watches politics, as a lady of quite passionate instincts, but you perhaps are very determined to be Prime Minister, and if you like, your heart is on the right, but your head is pretty firmly in the centre. Do you feel yourself to be at war with yourself in this way?
No, never. I'm in politics to do what I believe in doing.
Is that always possible, you say? Is it always possible to do what you believe?
No, it isn't, because my creed recognises that other people have different views, and to some extent, and obviously we have to compromise. It wouldn't be right for me to impose my views on others. My views are that others have views, and they're entitled to, and I'm not entitled to impose them, except when we've got a majority, then we all agree in the direction in which we should go. No, I don't. I do believe in things passionately, but I do know that I have to do a certain amount of compromising with people who say, but there are other things which you haven't considered. But I'm not just an eternal compromiser. I do believe things, and I believe that we've got to do certain things at the next election, otherwise the whole of a free society will be in jeopardy.
Do you believe that election will come this autumn?
I doubt it, but I'm ready for it if it does. I would prefer it.
Mrs. Thatcher, thank you very much indeed. And that ends this edition of Panorama. We'll be back again at 8:10 next Monday. Until then, from all of us here and from the Leader of the Opposition, good night.